Yeah. Okay, let's start. My name is Zoltan DNS, and I'm going to be talking about a very old approach to psychology, because psychology is actually a very old discipline. It goes back at least 2,500 years, and probably before that, probably as soon as we were able to talk and think, we were thinking about the mind. Of course, it wasn't known as psychology back then, and it was mixed in with other things like religious ideas. But if you go back to the Buddhist suttas, that is the Buddhist scriptures, they weren't put in writing until around about 200 BC, but they were probably preserved reasonably well because there were different renditions in different languages that we can compare. And what you find 500 BC is a theory of the mind, in other words, a psychology. You also find some religious ideas about reincarnation and so on, but I'll put them aside, and what I'd like to extract from what was there is the psychology. Now, the approach to psychology then, and what Gautama, or what you might know as the Buddha, what he asked you to do was to verify what he said against your experience. So he was asking you to be aware of your experience by way of evidence for certain claims. And we might call that introspectionism, and that was an approach that we had to psychology, say, 100 years ago. And you might say that we've replaced it, that we're no longer introspectionists, but we do psychology in other ways, say with controlled experiments and objective measures and so on. But it's not really that there's a dichotomy between the evidence of your own experience and other sorts of evidence. It's just that we can get evidence in a number of different ways, and what we've become aware of is the different ways in which we can fool ourselves and how to guard against that. So your experience does provide a certain sort of evidence. Indeed, you might say that your awareness of your own experience, you are an authority on that and what that means more than anybody else. So what I'll be doing in this lecture is asking you to engage in some exercises that Gautama asked people to engage in. We're going to touch them only very quickly, and people engage in these exercises for prolonged periods of time, but I think you'll still get something of a sense of the message that comes from these exercises. And on the basis of your own experience and your awareness of your experience as it is happening in the present moment, I'll ask you to evaluate some claims and see what you think of some claims that are made. But one thing to bear in mind, and it's an issue I'll come back to, is that introspection by itself doesn't tell you the causes of your experience. So we will have to move beyond just the evidence of our own experience in order to come up with a fully fledged psychology. But the extent to which what sort of claims we can have evidence for is something I'll be asking you to consider, and that's something that we'll return to at the end. And I should say, in the context of a module on clinical issues, this is an issue that arises quite a lot. For example, a psychoanalyst, a Freudian might say, I know my therapy works, and the patient might say, yeah, look, I'm certain it works because of my own experience, and someone else says, yeah, but what do randomized control trials show? And there's often an argument, a dispute between those sort of two different sorts of approaches. I think there shouldn't really be so much dispute as a careful consideration of what sort of claims you can have evidence for. Anyway, that's an issue we'll come back to. Now, one way of thinking about Gautama or Buddha was, we can think of him as a clinician. In fact, he portrayed himself as a clinician, and he wanted to deal with human suffering, and as far as he was concerned, he wasn't dealing with mentally ill people, he was dealing with people, because everyone suffers. And he said he had a solution, and a big part of that solution is understanding how things really are, and the way you're going to get that understanding is being more acutely aware of your experience than you're used to. So these are the sorts of exercises I'm going to ask you to engage in. Incidentally, I'm going to ask you to do various rather simple things, but don't feel obliged to do them. You'll always have the choice to do the little bit of meditation I say or not. And if you do it, you'll always have the choice to stop doing it at any time. Okay? So don't feel bad about not doing it or stop doing it. But I would say do have a go if you can and you feel comfortable about it, because it can be surprising. Even the very simple things I'll be asking you to do, what sort of experiences you have and the nature of your own experience. Now, you probably know that mindfulness has, the last 10 years or so has really hit the scene. There's mindfulness in education. My son does mindfulness in his council-run state school. There's mindfulness in business and mindfulness in therapy and so on. So mindfulness is a concept extracted from the Buddhist tradition, and the very earliest account we have of this, as I say, goes back about 2,500 years, is a Buddhist scripture or sutta called the Four Foundations of Mindfulness. And so I'll be taking you through a little taste of those foundations. The foundations are body, feelings, mind, and insight, and you'll see what that means as we go through it. And then, by way of the experiences that you have, seeing what claims you think follow from that, and if you think that that might help you in any way, considering those claims. So let's take the first foundation, which is the body. And in fact, in the sutra, there's about half a dozen exercises to do with the body, but perhaps the most famous, the one you might have come across before, is mindfulness of breath. So let's just start with some mindfulness of breath. And to get us going, this first step here is just to help you focus on the breath by exaggerating your breath a little bit. So if you want to sit with your feet flat on the ground, your back straight, your hands resting naturally in your lap, just close your eyes and try and breathe through your nose if you can, if your nose isn't too blocked up, so your mouth is closed. I'd like you to breathe in deeply, breathing in for 4 seconds, very roughly, and out for 6 seconds, very roughly. So nice, slow, deep breaths. And what I'd like you to do as you have those breaths is just pay attention to the breath as it goes in and as it goes out. So just be aware of the breath all the way in and all the way out. Okay, so now the purposes of the deep breaths was to make the breath salient. So now what I'd like you to do is to let the breath take on its natural rhythm as you pay attention to it. And I often find this a difficult thing to do, to pay attention to the breath without controlling it. But just see if you can do that. Just let the breath take on its own natural rhythm. And while it's doing that, be aware of the breath all the way in and all the way out. Now, as you pay attention to the breath going in and out, and you're trying to keep your awareness on that breath, you might find distractions happen. Your mind find other things that interest it. That's fine. But when you notice a distraction, notice that it is a distraction, and bring your mind back to the breath. In fact, a big part of this exercise is continuously bringing your mind back to the breath from the distraction. And so every time a distraction happens, that's actually good practice in bringing your mind back to your target, the breath, so you can be happy that you notice the distraction. Now be aware of all of the breath, and what I mean by that is maybe you can notice the breath at the tip of your nostrils or the top of your lip. Do you notice the breath just as it comes out there? And do you notice that the breath comes out of one nostril or the other, or both? For 80% of people, you only breathe through one nostril at a time, which changes every few hours, your nostril changes. Can you tell which nostril it's coming through? Can you tell what the temperature of the air is as it goes out as compared to when it goes in? And maybe you notice the breath also at the back of your mouth. You feel the breath as it passes the back of your mouth. And what about your chest? Do you notice your chest moves as you breathe? And you might notice your stomach moving as well. Your stomach moving in and out as you breathe. And so in some ways your whole body, or a lot of your body, takes part in the breathing, in that different parts of your body move as you breathe. So be aware of the whole body as it takes part in the breathing. Now, as you become aware of the whole passage of the breath and the whole body as it takes part in the breathing, you might notice something interesting, I'm not sure, but as you pay attention to different parts of the body, they seem to relax. So don't necessarily try and relax your body. If it does relax, that's okay. But as you attend to your body and your breathing is probably slightly slower than normal, and your body becomes probably more and more relaxed. Just notice what your body is doing as you're breathing. Okay, so that is a little example of breath meditation, and you can repeat that exercise any time. Some people recommend doing that for, say, 10 minutes a day or longer. Another aspect of mindfulness of body is the body scan. These are probably the two most popular versions of mindfulness of body. As I say, there's about half a dozen, but these were the versions that were taken out by John Kabat-Zinn, who set up secular mindfulness as a treatment for stress a few decades ago, and have become part of many mindfulness packages. So we'll do just a abbreviated body scan, which we'll do like this. So if you close your eyes and focus on your breath as you have been, but now just let your breath. Your awareness of your breath can stay there, but we're going to make it sort of background, because what you're going to do now is pay attention to different parts of your body. So if you could start with your scalp and where your hair is. So just pay attention to whatever sensations you feel on the top of your head. And then move your attention down your head from the top over your face, and see what sensations you feel over your face as you bring your attention down through your eyes and your nose, your ears and your cheeks, your lips and your mouth, and the back of your head. Maybe you can hold in your awareness all the sensations in your head. And then your neck and your throat. And your shoulders. How are your shoulders? And your chest. Is it moving from the breathing? And your internal organs. So, can you feel your heart at all? Sometimes when you're very still, you can feel your heartbeat. And your stomach. Fullness, stretching, emptiness, butterflies. Down your digestive tract. Your bladder. And move your arms, your awareness down your arms. Elbows and fingers. How do your fingers feel? What is the temperature? One sort of awareness you can have in your body is just the position of your limbs. You know where your limbs are without looking. You know how you're sitting. And your hips and bum and the contact on the seat. And down your legs to your feet and toes. What do you feel in your toes? Okay, that's good. So that was a body scan, a version of a body scan. And what you're doing there is you're just being aware of what is happening in different parts of your body right now in the present moment. Now, what are some of the things you might have noticed? Well, when you're breathing, you might have noticed that there was a blocked nostril. You might have noticed if there's any pain in how you're sitting or discomfort. Any wheezing or sensation of coughing or itchiness in the nose. These are some things you might have noticed which you might have regarded as maybe not entirely comfortable or satisfactory. And the same in the body scan, you might have noticed any tension in the muscles or any pains or discomfort. You might have noticed numbness. Maybe you noticed that you couldn't notice something somewhere. Now, one way of summarizing a whole bunch of things you could have noticed is there are always problems. Now, one way you can notice this with your breathing, which you'll all notice if you pay attention to, is as you breathe in, you need to breathe out. There comes a moment, you'll notice, as you breathe in, where there's a need to breathe out. And similarly, when you breathe out, there will come a time, you'll notice, where there's this urge and this need to breathe in. That's a natural part of breathing, so obviously that's going to come. And so that, in a way, is a problem, right? A problem doesn't mean something you have to be unhappy about or distressed about. A problem is something that has to be solved. And you do solve it because you breathe in and then you breathe out. So there are always problems. And you could say problems, as I said, problems aren't something necessarily to be happy about, because what is life about other than solving problems? What else could life be about? But do we always take on board in our moment-to-moment reaction to things that there are always problems? Now, what that means is if you solve a problem by breathing in, there's going to be another problem. The solution to the problem is never the eternal solution. The solution to the problem just creates another problem. And yet we often go through life thinking we'll solve our problems. And we do this sort of in an unreflective way. So maybe we think we are going to be happy and have no problems once this has happened, even if it's something as simple as eating something you really want to eat next. Then, once we've got that, no more problems. Of course, if we think about it, we know that that's a bit silly. Or, if only my partner wouldn't do this. Or if I got a new partner. Or, what about that car or that house? If only I moved house to here. Sort of in the back of your mind, you're saying, and then no more problems. So the first conclusion that Gautama would ask you to bear in mind is there are always problems. You'll never, ever, ever solve your problems for good. So that means your moment-to-moment experience is always going to be, there's always going to be something unsatisfactory about it, because that's what it means for there to be a problem. So what Gautama was asking you to do, and one of the points of these meditations, is to not just sort of know that intellectually as a debating point, but as a way that you instinctively react moment to moment, in every moment, to every situation that comes up, that you fully take that on board. And we're going to take this further with the second foundation. So I'm going to start by, if you close your eyes, and just be aware of your breath again. Now, as you're aware of your breath, you're aware of various sensations to do with breathing. But you also be aware of any distracting material that comes into your head, which will come, because that's the nature of the mind, to thrust all sorts of things upon you, and it does that for a good evolutionary reason. It wants to make sure you don't forget something important. So your mind's always going to throw lots of different things at you all the time, even when you're trying to concentrate, to make sure you don't forget something. The different bits of the mind are competing to make sure their priorities are dealt with. So you've all come across distractions, and you can bring your attention back to your breath, as I said. Now, for all those sensations and thoughts that arise, we can regard them as being pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. So in the Buddhist terminology, that's what feeling meant. It meant whatever mental state that arises, is it pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral? So if the thought came into your head of a bit of cake you'd like to eat later, there might be a pleasant feeling. If you felt a little bit of ill will towards someone who's annoyed you because of the great injustice that they've done, well, that's an unpleasant feeling. And maybe just being aware of your breath at this moment could be, I'm not saying it is, but it could be a neutral feeling. So what I'd like you to do now is to note, for any of those feelings, for any of the mental states that come up, just note to yourself whether it's pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. Just be aware of whether it's pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. But don't react to that. Don't let that go further in any way. Just let the thought come up, note it as pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, and then let it go. Bring your mind back to your breath. Note whether whatever is there now is pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. Don't react to it, just let it go and bring your mind back to the breath. I'll leave you to do that for a little bit. Now, what I would like you to do is notice upon what that feeling depends, and what Gautama regarded as depending on was contact of your sense organ with its sense object. Or contact, and he regarded a mind as a sort of sense organ as well, which can contact its sort of mental objects. So if, for example, the sensation of the coolness of the air on your face is pleasant, upon what does that depend? Well, the contact of your temperature receptors in your skin with the air. That's the contact of the sense organ with its receptors, and that gives you a pleasant feeling. So that's upon which the pleasant feeling depends. Or if you happen to be opening your eyes and you look at something, your eyes make contact with the object you're looking at. That could give rise to a pleasant sight, to an unpleasant sight, to a neutral sight. So upon what does that pleasantness depend? It depends on the contact of your eyes with this sense object. Or if it's a distracting thought that you're having in your mind, it depends on the contact of your mind with that thought object. It's a funny way of putting it, but it's how Gautama thought about it. So notice, because that pleasant feeling depends on contact, that pleasant feeling will come, but it will go, because the contact is a temporary condition. So the feeling that you have is a temporary state. So what I'd like you to do is do the exercise again and note the feelings without reacting to them. So if you have a negative feeling about someone who's done a great injustice to you, just note the negative feeling, but don't get lost in a train of revenge thoughts and so on, or how bad that person is. Just note the feeling. It's negative. It depends on my mind making contact with that person or the concept of that person, and then let it go. Bring your mind back to your breath and then see what else comes up. Notice pleasant, unpleasant or neutral. Notice what it depends. Let it go. Okay, I'll give you a little bit of time to do that. Okay, so I regard that as a particularly important step in this process, is becoming aware of the positive and negative, the pleasant and unpleasant feelings that arise in us all the time. We habitually have these positive and negative feelings, which are temporary. They'll come and they go. But it's what happens next in the chain that is very important. But it's the feelings part where we can stop the chain of events from happening. So we're going to do a tiny bit of the third foundation, which is being aware of the mind, the condition of the mind as a whole. But what in particular I'd like you to do is be aware of the breath, and notice the distraction that comes up. Notice if that distraction involves craving something. That means really wanting something, feeling like you must have it. Or if the distraction involves some aversion or ill will, means you really don't want something. You're averse or repelled or upset by something. Okay? So what I'd like you to do is just notice if there's any trace at all of craving or aversion in the distraction. Don't react to it. Just let it go and just notice if it's there or not. And then bring your mind back to your breath. Go. Okay, so now we're going to do the same feeling, but we're going to the same exercise, but now we're going to think about upon what does the craving or aversion depend. Gautama asked you to notice that when you have a craving, it depends on a feeling. So craving generally depends on a positive feeling. So you're concentrating on your breath, and all of a sudden a thought of a muffin arises, and that a muffin is associated with a pleasant feeling, and you start to crave the muffin. Or you're concentrating on your breath, and then a feeling of ill will arises, and what does it depend upon? Well, notice the unpleasant feeling from which the ill will arose. Maybe the feeling that someone's done you some injustice. So what I'd like you to do now is exactly the same exercise. Notice in your distractions if there's any craving or aversion, and then notice the feeling on which it depends, pleasant or unpleasant, and then notice that feeling, and then let it go. So make sure you don't get involved in any chain of thoughts that spiral away from the exercise. Distractions will come up, just notice them, notice the feeling upon which they depend, let it go, and bring your attention back to your breath. Go. Okay, very good. So now, let me move on to the second principle that Gautama draws from these sorts of exercises. The way we react to there being problems is to think up a solution. So far, so good. But then we think that if we could hold the solution true, unchanging forever, then that would be the end of our problems. But that solution is the problem. That is the source of our distress and our suffering, is precisely this, according to Gautama, the thought that if only we could keep something the same indefinitely, then there will be no more problems at last. But it is this solution, and this is the, you could say, what craving is. Craving is, if I could only have this thing and then keep it forever, my precious, we needs it, then that will be, finally, our problem solved. But it's the attempt to do this, to cling, and to think you must have something that creates the suffering, the distress. All distress, Gautama thought, was based on this. So this is a sort of an illusion. You think that your solution is going to last forever. There was a little exercise I gave my son. I typically take him for an ice cream each Saturday. And of course he's greatly looking forward to the ice cream beforehand. And of course he thinks he would like to have lots of ice cream. So I asked him to take the ice cream, could be his favourite flavour, and then tell me how much pleasure he was getting from it. And then to tell me that pleasure as the minutes went by and he was lapping away at the ice cream. So of course at the beginning there's a fantastic amount of pleasure. You know, this is the solution. This is great. If only this would last forever. But of course, a minute into the ice cream, and try this with yourself, it doesn't take very long, you notice the pleasure's not, it's not quite so fantastic as it was right at the very beginning of this watermelon ice cream. And then a few minutes in, it's really not that great at all. So is the solution to, and he realized the solution wasn't to keep eating watermelon ice cream forever, because that wasn't going to be satisfying in the end. But somehow our minds tell us that the the solution, if only we could keep it going. And I think our mind is telling us, as a way of an illusion, that we accept unreflectively forever, then that'll be it, problem solved. And I think you could also say this is why there's so many problems in the world. And I think it's why we have authoritarian governments. Because they say, we know the solution to the political problems. It needs to be set up thus. But we better make sure we keep it thus forever, make sure nobody else changes it, because otherwise it's going to be chaos and it's going to be horrible. So we must enforce this political solution, because if we can just keep it like this forever, political problem solved. But that's not right, is it? Because if there's always problems, once you've introduced a political solution, there's still going to be problems. You can't keep it the same forever. That's not the solution. There's going to be a new problem, you have to be solved, so you always have to be open to new problems and new solutions in politics, but also in your moment-to-moment existence, including eating ice cream. Now, I'm not sure if you noticed this, but when you noticed some pleasant feeling leading to a craving, did it help at all that you were mindful of the craving and the feeling? In other words, your ability to note the pleasant feeling there, did that help stop the craving? It's not guaranteed to, by the way, but sometimes people find that mindfulness in itself can be part of the solution. So you might, just to give you an example, when I was coming off the train this morning, you have lots of people coming through, trying to get through the Falmer gates there. There's someone who sort of moves in front of you, and that, of course, everyone's jostling to get to the gate, and you can sort of sense there's a slight, it's not quite a panic, but there's a slight urge to get through that gate first. So there can be an unpleasant feeling. I know it's an unpleasant feeling. Someone, hold on, that was my right to go through the gate at that point. It's not really. It's just people going through gates. It doesn't matter if I got through the gate 2 seconds later than that point. So it can help to note the negative feeling, note the sort of that slight feeling of ill will that depended on that negative feeling, and then let it go. So this is sort of an exercise you can apply in everyday life, whether you're driving, walking, whatever it is, whatever's happening. There's always going to be problems, right? There's always going to be obstacles to you. The universe doesn't set up life so you get everything that you want. It is the nature of the universe that there will always be obstacles. So there's always going to be pleasant and unpleasant feelings. It's up to you how you react to them. But by noticing that they're there, you then gain the choice, don't you, of how you're going to react, in principle. So there are ways to reduce and even eliminate the distress, but you'll never eliminate the problems. So that's not the goal, to eliminate problems. The goal is to eliminate the suffering or distress that you create in yourself because of the necessary existence of problems. So the way Gautama often expressed this is in what you call the chain of dependent arising. So we'll start with the body, including the sense organs. We did that in the first foundation, being mindful of the body. Then in the second foundation, we saw that the sense organs making contact lead to feelings, pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral, and that's what we did in the second foundation. And then those feelings lead to craving and clinging. You can either crave something is, you could call that desire, or crave something is not, and that's aversion and ill will, and we did that in the third foundation. So this process by which certain events and conditions and mental states tend to cause other ones is the chain of dependent arising that leads to, in Gautama's view, to suffering, and is the route to suffering. But it's not a necessary chain in that it can be stopped. Say mindfulness at key links, particularly feelings, is the way that this chain can be stopped. And it's not the only chain. So let's consider another one. I'll consider what are called the 4 boundless states. And they're boundless because what you're trying to do is create certain positive feelings that you don't limit. And you'll see what I mean as we go through this. These are the 4 states we're going to go through. So if you just close your eyes, and let's just settle for a little bit by concentrating on your breath. Now what I'd like you to do is feel some friendliness in you. So friendliness means that if you were to meet someone, you'd feel open and warm towards them. Now think of all the people in front of you, all through space, all the way in front of you, all the way down through the campus and out, and just get the sense of friendliness to all those people, and animals if you like, in the sense that if you were to bump into any of them, you'd feel warm and open. And now think of all the people, keep that friendliness flowing in front of you. Now think of all the people to the left of you. Think of all the people to the left of you in this auditorium here, and feel some friendliness towards them. Maybe you can even picture who some of those people are and feel some friendliness towards them. And then all the people to the left of you, all the way without bound to the left. So feel friendliness to the front and to the left, and now to the right. Maybe you can imagine some of the people to the right of you. And without bound to the right, imagine being friendly to those people. But if you were to bump into any of them, you'd feel warm and open. And now behind you, all those people behind you. Maybe you can imagine some of those people behind you and feel friendly towards them. So now flow friendliness all around you, like you were an orb, just flowing friendliness in all directions without bound. Now we'll do compassion. So compassion means if someone's suffering, you'd like to help them. So in front of you, feel compassion for all the people in front of you. So if you were to meet someone who's in front of you and they were suffering in some way, you'd like to help. For Buddha, what that actually meant was teaching them how to be mindful and deal with distress mindfully. But however you wish, you'd like to help. Now all the people to the left of you, if any of them are suffering, and everyone suffers, because there are always problems, so we all have our problems, so it'd be nice to help them. And all the people to the right of you, you know they have problems, because there are always problems. So feel compassion to all those people to the right. And now behind you, imagine some of the people behind you and feel you'd like to help them. Now flow compassion all around you like you're a globe, flowing compassion without bound in all directions. And now what I'll call sympathetic joy, which means you feel joy in other people's joy. So when someone's happy, you feel happy for them. So all the people in front of you, they'll be happy sometimes, and some of them will be, and feel happy for their happiness. And to the left of you, imagine some of the people there, and imagine them, how they could be happy, and you feel happy for their happiness. And to the right, feel joy in the joy of all those to your right. And behind you, feel joy in whatever joy the people are feeling behind you. And the final boundless state is equanimity, which means a sense of fairness. That you'll feel these feelings without prejudice. No matter what beliefs these people have, no matter what religion or colour, even if they disagree with you in major points, you can still feel friendly compassion and joy for those people, because they are people like you who suffer like you, and they all have problems just like you do. So feel that equanimity all around you. So you feel a connection with all humanity all around. Okay, very good. So that is a meditation. It actually precedes Gautama, but he picked it up and took it on as one of his meditations. So one of the conclusions Gautama came through is the mind is a process of conditional causation, which means it's simply a set of mental states and condition causing other mental states. One conclusion from this is that there is no self. I'm not going to dwell on this, but I did talk about this in the lecture, the same lecture I gave for this module last year. I concentrated on the question of self. So indeed, you could put that recording up if you wanted to get at this material from a completely different angle. It's really the same material I've been talking about, but from a completely different angle. So one set of conditional causation I was talking about is how contact can lead to pleasant, unpleasant feelings, can lead to craving and suffering. They can also have kindness and compassion, leading to a sense of interconnectedness and joy. Now, Gautama asked you not to accept these claims just because he said them, but to notice it in your own experience. So if you did notice these things in your own experience, based on the exercises we've been doing, then that is the evidence of your own experience that he was asking you to be the means by which you evaluated what he said. Now, the fourth foundation is insight, and what that really means is you then apply the sorts of ideas we've been using in a systematic way to more thoroughly eradicate suffering. We're just going to do this very quickly, and I'm going to take two tiny little bits of this, so it won't be fully systematic. You won't get an idea of the full systematicity that defines the fourth foundation, but we'll do a little bit of it. So here's something you can do. In the third foundation, we finished with you noticing some craving and that it depended on the feeling. Now I'd like you to do something more than simply being mindful of it, but to concentrate on the impermanence of the feeling. So you know that craving is based on a feeling that will surely disappear. That craving for the muffin, the watermelon ice cream, that feeling will go even when you have the watermelon ice cream. Having the thing you want doesn't prolong the pleasant feeling indefinitely. And there's another little antidote you can apply in the case of feelings of ill will. You can apply those boundless feelings. If you're feeling ill will towards something, towards somebody, see if you can feel friendliness or compassion or sympathetic joy towards them. Because your mind can't both hold hatred in itself and kindness and compassion at the same time. So just give that a little go, noticing the craving and the aversion, then applying these little antidotes just for a minute. Let's go. All right, that's good. Now, the fourth foundation, what one does is one gets rid of the negative states with various antidotes, like I just gave you a tiny taste of. Then one builds up various positive states, which you call the aspects of awakening. For example, one becomes aware of the breath, and one becomes mindful of one's mindfulness. And then one becomes mindful of whether one's mental states are skillful ones, like the boundless states I talked about, concentration, mindfulness, or unskillful states, which are just not the skillful ones. And one becomes aware of one's mental states as being skillful or unskillful. And then one becomes aware of the effort or energy that can become created in settling on skillful states. And one builds up to the 7 aspects of awakening. So the fourth principle Gautama concluded from all this is that there is a path to removing craving and suffering, and what it specifically consists of is understanding the process. And I've given you part of his diagnosis here and part of his solution, using meditation to get a moment-to-moment insight into the process and cultivating new habits so that you react in different ways. You don't react to positive feelings by craving and negative feelings by ill will. You react simply by being mindful of them and letting them go. And then incorporating the insight you gain from meditation into everyday life, into all aspects of your life. So meditation, as it were, this sort of insight becomes part of just how you relate to people and how you do things. And that was his path. So these are the 4 principles that he said could be based on the evidence of your own, as it were, introspection, awareness of your experience. That can be derived from the 4 foundations of mindfulness that I've in part taken you through. So I'm not sure if what you got out of that, but these are ideas I found in myself, ones that when I first came across, I think, okay, fair enough. But then they sort of creep and infiltrate your thinking. And it took a long time for me to sort of fully realize or appreciate or benefit from thinking that way, but indeed I did. And in fact, some years ago I started meditating, and one of the things you notice in meditation is when you first sit down to meditate and just say you just start following your breath, is you're thinking about all the other things you'd rather be doing. Right, that's the distraction. But then I found when I was doing other things, I was thinking about how I'd rather be meditating. So that's when I realized that the meditation had sort of taken on it was rewarding for its own sake. I wasn't doing it for anything else. I was just doing it because I appreciated the insight and the understanding that I was gaining from it. So now I don't, in fact, meditate for any reason other than the meditative experience itself and how that sort of, I wouldn't say satisfy, but it allows me to play with the curiosity I have about my own mind, and that's why I meditate. But one reason why I started was because of the scientific evidence for it. And I think you do need some other reason to start with, because you're not going to sit down and meditate frequently unless you've got a reason, because to begin with it's going to feel rather boring and you're not going to be entirely sure why you're doing it. So now I wanted to move on, just to finish with, the issue of what other evidence do we need for meditation, or what can we can gain something from the evidence of our own experience, but the evidence of our own experience just tells us what we are experiencing. That is the claim that we have evidence for. I'm experiencing this right now. And that's been good enough for me in order to continue meditating. But as soon as we make a claim like mindfulness meditation reduces anxiety and depression, now we're making a claim about cause. We're saying that if people persist in these sorts of exercises, depression scores will go down. Now we need empirical evidence in the form of randomized control studies that we as experimental psychologists engage in. So what we would need to do to answer a claim like that is randomly assign participants to mindfulness or an active control condition. We need to measure depression and anxiety on established scales, so we know that we are measuring depression and anxiety. What I mean by an active control is we need to take into account that there can be placebo effects. The therapies can work not because of the claim mechanism, but simply because people believe that they will work. So there's expectation effects. And so if we're going to compare mindfulness to something else, we need an active control. An active control is something the person believes will work just as well as the mindfulness meditation. Now that, I think, has rarely been done within mindfulness research. There's a whole lot of mindfulness research that you're going to hear about, I believe, in the next lecture. But often if you compare a mindfulness treatment with just a waiting list control, people having the mindfulness treatment know they're being treated in a certain way, and indeed they might have very high expectations about mindfulness given the general cultural beliefs about mindfulness. That is going to have an impact all by itself. So we need to measure expectations for the two treatments, including the active control, and show that the expectations are the same between the two. And then we need to collect data, and we need to make sure we analyze it in in an appropriate way, and we make all the data transparently available for anybody else to analyze so they can dispute our findings. So I would say, although I haven't kept up with the mindfulness literature, that the court, in terms of scientific evidence, cannot yet decide absolutely what mindfulness is good for and what it isn't. So I just want to then leave you with that thought that there are different sorts of evidence out there, and going by your own experience is one thing, and that's a good thing, and that can enable you to conclude certain sorts of things, like what are the experiences that I'm having, and whether you want to have those experiences or not. But as soon as you make causal claims, and claims for clinical effectiveness, we need to move over to controlled studies as well. So, I've now said everything I want to say. Perhaps just before I wrap up, what might be interesting if you just turn around to the person next to you and tell them what you got out of the little meditations that we had, and whether you agree with any of the claims that I've said follow from them.